I feel like we're in February 2020. The virus is just about to hit. We're hearing all this news. Everything's going on normally, but next month we are in major crisis. While I won't say that this is something as dramatically impactful as that was, I do get the same feeling in the sense that we're taking, well, I won't say taking this lightly, but people are just going on and not changing their behaviors.
Hi, I'm Sharad Kutin, and on the Breakfast Grille with me this morning is Nurhisham Hussein. He's Economic Advisor in the Prime Minister's Office and the Head of the Secretariat of the Crisis Management Task Force team of the National Economic Action Council. He's here to speak to us about Putrajaya's strategies to deal with what is being called a supply-side crisis, sparked, of course, by the American and Israeli attack on Iran on February the 28th. So, Hisham, we're going to have to start with the bad news because I think that's the only honest thing to do. And you said in other interviews that this crisis is going to hit us in waves. The first one is already here and more to come ahead. But before I ask you what you believe is coming, were we at all prepared for this crisis?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today.
You're welcome.
Always a pleasure. I think in a certain sense, we started from a position of strength. We, of course, as oil and gas producer, we have supplies onshore. We have our own refineries. I think one of the issues that Australia ran into was that even though they are also a major oil and gas producer, they didn't have enough refining capacity to actually supply themselves. So that's one of the reasons why, we had Albanese coming to Malaysia and Brunei and Singapore and the like. So in that sense, we had a buffer, so to speak, both in terms of the supply side, in terms of our relationship with oil and gas traders, major oil and gas traders. So we were more able to easily secure supplies than a lot of the countries around the region. So in that sense, we were, I wouldn't say prepared. We don't subscribe to the IEA. We're not a member. So that means we don't actually have a strategic reserve per se, not like the other OECD countries. But we had supplies onshore. So
right.
In that
Should
sense,
we be a member of the...
That's a policy decision, and there's pros and cons, right? It does provide some access, I think, to further supplies, but like I said, I don't think we really need that. I know we're looking at the possibility of improving our own onshore storage capacity, but the private players are doing that already. I've spoken to a number of them. They're actually expanding their own storage capacity onshore. So again, that'll give us another buffer.
Okay, let's talk about the priorities. You've already, said this in several interviews: fuel, food, and medicine. Could you talk us through that in terms of the timeline that you have, set out? We've had the first wave. You say 2 more waves are coming. I think in the last interview you did with Astro One, you talked about a June, July kind of an inflection point.
Yes. Fuel, obviously, I think that's critical. As I said, we don't have a reserve per se, so it's really on a month-to-month basis. Petronas controls roughly about half the market internally. They've been able to assure the supply. The other oil companies, not so much. So I think the major players, yes, they've managed to secure supplies. I think we're up to 70-80% for July. So we've already got June. We're getting the July figures. Petronas is committed to supplying the rest if necessary. So we seem to be okay on that score. On the medicine front, I think KKM did a major exercise. I think they already have their own internal stock inventories for the public system. So they have to go out and find out what the state of play in the private system is concerned. What we see is roughly about 2 months stock at retail, 2 months stock at the distribution level, and 2 months stock at manufacturing level. So we got about 5 or 6 months worth. That's obviously for major medicines. There are certain areas where we're a little short. I think there's 11 that's in a critical state, but that's basically very low volume, very low usage medicines that we hope we don't need to use, like antivenom for snakes, right? So that's generally, you can't keep it very long, and it's a very low probability event, so you don't actually keep a whole lot of stock on hand anyway. I think in terms of medical devices, and I think the medical device term is probably a little misleading because it includes things like consumables like gloves and sutures and face masks and stuff like that. Generally speaking, the fast-moving stuff, we've got about month-plus supply. But because it's a fast-moving item, we do have assurances from the suppliers that they will be able to provide that if necessary. The areas that are short tend to be the ones that are longer-term, where you might buy once in every 5 years kind of a thing. So that's okay. Food we're good for, I think, towards the end of the year. On a month-to-month basis, we're keeping track of the supply. I actually chair a supplies committee meeting every week just to check on where we are. So far, it's okay. But there's a longer-term dimension to that, obviously. With there's two things. One, obviously, is that a lot of fertilizer comes from the oil and gas industry. So we have onshore enough urea. We get potash from Australia. We are a little short on potassium and ammonia, but we're looking for those. And about 90% of the fertilizer actually goes to palm oil. So it's only about 10% that actually goes to the food industries. So we're relatively good for that. The concern here is that because global fertilizer is a bit short, it could have a downstream impact, further down the line. And we know that, for example, in the US, in South America, even here in Malaysia, there's some planters or some petani who can't actually plant because they cannot get access to supply. So that'll hit us, I think, towards the end of the year next year. So that's something that we're watching very carefully.
Right, and so thanks for kind of laying it all out for us. But I want to talk about the question of waves, because you use this as a very interesting metaphor for the way in which we should think about experiencing this crisis. I think at this point in time, except for perhaps people using diesel,
yes,
things seem okay. They seem like nothing's really changed. And is that in fact quite dangerous? I mean, especially for people in Putrajaya trying to manage expectations.
Yep.
What's going on here?
I feel like we're in February 2020. All right, the virus is just about to hit. We're hearing all this news. Everything's going on normally, but next month we are in major crisis. And while I won't say that this is something as dramatically impactful as that was, I do get the same feeling in the sense that we're taking, I won't say taking this lightly, but people are just going on and not changing their behaviors. And I think that's something that we'll need to try to address. And it's one reason why I'm here today is actually to try to talk about this and get people more aware of what's going on. Okay,
aware but not alarmed,
yes.
Clearly. I do. Yeah, so the question though, and let's come back to the fuel thing, because I think in the question of fuel shortages, today we had news because that Trump has rejected the Iranian offer for a ceasefire, for long-term peace in the Gulf. Now, what does that mean for supplies? Because there are things that are, unless you're in the industry, you don't quite understand. The spigot just doesn't get turned on immediately when, peace is announced. So please talk us through that.
So that very first month of running this team, I had a very extensive education in the petrochemical industry. So what we were told, and this is both from the industry itself as well as direct communication between RPM and the Middle Eastern leaders, is that because the supply was shut off, or the oil couldn't move outside the Strait of Hormuz, and you can't leave the oil just gushing. So they had to shut in the wells. So we have roughly about 12 to 13 million barrels per day that's actually shut in today. And shut in means is that you're not turning off the faucet. You're actually cementing over the whole pipe. And opening that pipe again is basically like opening a new well. So it takes a minimum of 3 months to reopen a well that's been shut in. Depending on the soil conditions. Sometimes it's a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. But effectively, if the war ended tomorrow, I would say 3/4 of the oil in the Middle East will not be able to come on stream for at least 3 months. And that's not even talking about clearing the traffic jam. We got thousands of ships within the Straits of Hormuz that can't get out. And just clearing that will take, I'm told it will take another 2 to 3 months. And even if you open an oil well, it will take another 3 months because they have to slowly build up the pressure and everything. So what they tell us is that it'll take 6 months from start to end in terms of the process. And of course, you got to ship it out, right? So we don't see a normalization of oil supply, and the clock hasn't even started ticking because we've still got this war going on. It'll take 6 months from the date the war ends for supplies to normalize. So, we're talking about basically the end of the year or maybe even into 2027 before we see normalization of oil supplies. And it's worse because we're not just talking about oil, right? That's wave one. Wave one was just the fuel supply. It's also about petrochemicals. And I didn't understand just how much our economy depends on petrochemicals until, we started running this team. And it's almost everything, right? Our whole economy runs on plastics. It runs on nylon. It runs on polyester. It runs on naphtha and all these derivatives that go into things like cosmetics and hygiene products, sanitary towels, diapers, your toothbrush, right? 70% of a car is actually made out of plastic. So it has very wide-ranging impact on our entire way of life, so to speak. And the reason why I talked about waves is that, yes, the first wave was about fuel, shortage of fuel, prices of fuel. The second wave is when we start running out of the basic feedstock for petrochemicals. Now, my understanding is that when we talked to a lot of companies over the last couple of months, most of them are okay for about 2 months worth of stock, I think, in terms of raw materials. So that was roughly around mid-March or so. And they'll be looking for more. I think FMM just released the latest survey results, which was conducted, I think, mid-April. And I think most of the large companies were okay. SMEs were struggling a bit. Roughly about 10-15% had only about 1 or 2 weeks left, I think, in terms of supply. And so that's why I'm thinking when we talk about the economic impact of this, I think in terms of the shortage of supply, it's going to hit us in June. We're going to start seeing production stoppages. We're going to start seeing people losing overtime, shift reductions, things like that, and it'll be a slow process.
Hisham, you laid out the problem, as it were, and and you said there are costs that are coming our way. In fact, in an interview you did on Astro Awani with Melissa Idris, you spoke about how subsidies are costing the government 2,300 ringgit per second, which is about 200 million ringgit every day. Is that number still the same today? More importantly, who's paying for this?
Okay. It's a little lower because I think oil prices have fallen since then. I think one of the issues in April specifically was that there was such a scramble for oil that the market prices were not reflective of what we were actually paying. There was a huge premium on prices. We're paying $40, $50 over the market price. And because the market price are future prices, it's the premiums in single digits now, so it's not so expensive. I haven't done the calculations recently, but I think it's probably around 1,500, 1,700 per second now. Still very expensive, but a bit more manageable.
And where's this money coming from? Because we had the budget,
yes,
and it didn't anticipate this moment. So
absolutely not. Yes.
So what are we taking from kind of future earnings? Is this a burden that's going to be left for younger Malaysians?
So I think this is a bit of a long explanation, but the way the government is funded in Malaysia is unique. So even within the constitution, what's called the current account has to balance. You cannot have a current account deficit. And what I mean by current account is that operating expenditure cannot exceed the government's revenue. This is in the constitution. You can't change it, right? And within the various acts that allow for borrowing, all borrowing can only be used for development purposes. So we actually have two different funds within the government. One's called the Consolidated Fund, which is where all the tax and expenditure comes from. And then we have the Development Fund, which is for big projects and water and electricity and roads and stuff like that. So you can only borrow for that. So in the context of subsidies, every dollar that we pay out in subsidy has to come from somebody. And generally speaking, given that the budget was set, I think in 2025, I think for this year, we're having to adjust the budget, I think, in terms of expenditure to actually account for this massive increase in subsidies. And I would say that at this moment in time, who will actually be having the allocations cut and by how much is still under discussion.
But we have had some news flow on that. And I want to bring up this number because the expected subsidy bill was something like 15 billion. 50. It's quadrupled. But the cut that is now been announced is 10 billion. Far shorter than the 45 extra billion that's now on the tab. I want to talk to you about some of those items because they do impact the priorities that you listed out. You talked about food. Now, rural development, it's not a ministry that gets a lot of attention. It's expected to cut $500 million from its budget, and these go to supporting fishermen, the rural sector, our food security. So is this wise? I mean, why are you cutting, or why is the government cutting rural development if food security is a priority?
Or healthcare,
and we'll get to healthcare because there's been a lot of angst about that too, and education, which is about the future and young people.
Yes. So I think, again, it goes back to the fiscal rules that we operate under. They're very hard and fast rules. You can't get around them, unfortunately. We are looking at possible ways around of raising further revenue as well as optimizing further revenue. Optimizing the expenditure side. There are certain things that we can cut fairly easily, like just freezing hiring, right? Which actually does address some future expenditure because it reduces pension liabilities at the same time. But also things like events and travel and stuff like that. Unfortunately, not quite enough to cover the subsidy, so we're looking at other ways of doing that. One option that I think we might look at is something similar to the COVID Act, right? Just for the short term, where we have a specific fund dedicated to just covering this particular emergency. Other ways of doing it, I think, unfortunately, can't be avoided. You simply have to cut the expenditure. This is a issue that this is a long-standing issue, I think, in the way the government manages crises, because this is not the first time this has happened. It happened during COVID, it happened during 2008, it happened during 1997. And the reality is that people are worried about the deficit, but the deficit actually is probably only going to go up because the denominator fell, which is GDP.
Right. I do want to come back to why these ministries. I mean, healthcare and education, each 3 billion ringgit. They're the most front-facing of the ministries. I mean, this is about people. Galen Center for Health and Social Policy, criticized this move. I know I think the details are only expected mid this month in terms of what actually gets cut. But they're saying the cost of this cut will be paid in delayed procedures, longer lists, medicine shortages, deteriorating facilities, exhausted healthcare workers, and so on and so forth, preventable deaths. I mean, it's a list that really is quite stark in what it's projecting will happen. Is that what's going to happen?
I think that's a bit sensationalism. One is that whatever basic services that we provide is going to be guaranteed. You're looking at cutting those expenditures that are more discretionary, right? There is no thought within the government that that we're going to compromise basic services. Well, that is the absolute last resort. Well, the second last, absolute last resort is basically cutting salaries entirely. But we don't want to do that either, because that supports the economy as well. Like I said, I think the issue is that this was a very preliminary letter to the ministries to look at the budgets and examine what areas can be cut. The reason why we had healthcare and education so prominent is that their budgets have been expanded rapidly over the last 3 years. and as a result, they're the biggest. And obviously, when you look at proportional cuts, then their names came up first, right? So again, I think it was a very preliminary letter to the ministries. It was not meant for public distribution.
Oh, it was leaked, was it?
It was leaked.
Okay.
And so, we haven't even, this was just a starting point for discussion between MOF and the other ministries. So it was never meant to be announced. It was not meant to be final.
It clearly caused panic. And,
obviously.
Yeah, it's
I
not
can
been good
understand
for the
that.
government.
Yeah. So, and it was actually a secret document. So we're trying to trace who actually leaked it. But that's beside the point. But the reality is that those are the two biggest budgets. So that's why they were looking at those first.
We want to focus now, Hisham, on the question of the help the government can give to businesses. Yeah. I know you've been going around and talking to business owners and industry leaders. What is it that you're gathering about what's happening on the ground?
I think in terms of the impact of this crisis, it's been highly concentrated in certain areas, especially those that are exposed to petrochemicals. So construction, manufacturing, tourism for obvious reasons, anybody who uses a lot of diesel. So for example, the agriculture sector. And we're finding gaps in, I think, our support systems that we're looking at fixing. Obviously, you don't, do that very well in the middle of a crisis. But whatever shortfalls that we see, I think we're trying to fix. One area, for example, is that we support, paddy farmers and the like. I think in terms of, subsidized fertilizer and seeds and things like that. But it turns out they also have an exposure to machinery, which uses diesel. Right, when they do the penanaman and stuff like that, and so we're looking at fixing that part. I think there's differences. I think in terms of licensing for vehicles, commercial vehicles, that were also an issue. For example, tourism buses didn't get subsidized diesel, but school buses and factory buses did. But those factory buses and school buses occasionally went into tourism chartering, chartered tourism, because they'll take tourists around on short charter trips and things like that. So there was an unfair competitive advantage that we're trying to address. I think on the whole, what we've seen so far is, yes, the diesel exposure, I think some cash flow issues because those where raw material prices have increased significantly. One, there's a shortage of supply. Obviously, you're tying up a lot more of your working capital and raw materials. And I think credit terms have tightened quite a bit. Some suppliers are demanding cash rather than on credit, so that's increased cash flow pressure on quite a few businesses. I
understand that's where the government is offering help in terms of cash flow. I mean, how exactly is this being rolled out?
So there's two facilities at the moment. One is under the government's guarantee scheme, SJPP. That's open to crisis-hit industries. That allows for, I think, 80% guarantee coverage. I think fairly long tenures, I think about 7 years to 10 years. And easy access to credit. I think the banks are willing to help. The figures we have so far is that over R1 billion has already been restructured, I think, in terms of loans. We're trying to solidify those numbers because this is something that Bank Negara didn't capture before. So they're working on actually getting more consistent data on what's happening on the ground, I think, in terms of loan restructuring and things like that. And second, Bank Negara itself has created a 5 billion relief facility that's also open for businesses. Whatever existing facilities, we've actually asked for the agencies involved to actually accelerate, I think, the outlay of funds to help businesses. And I think last week we also announced that, at least at federal level, we'll cut rental for small hawkers and street traders and the like in the major cities. And we're hoping the states will follow suit. I think Sarawak has already done that as well. So that'll, again, help reduce cash flow pressure on those businesses on the ground.
Are you expecting any businesses or any sectors to see shutdowns, retrenchments? I mean, where is it most sensitive to this particular crisis?
My feeling is both it's construction and manufacturing, those that are highly dependent on petrochemical feedstock, right? Plastic, for example. We've managed to secure extra supplies. They're looking for alternatives as well. We got a list of, I think, 60 different items, I think, in terms of supplies that are short, and we're helping FMM to actually source alternative areas as well. The issue there is that whatever alternative supplies could have the wrong specification, not quite to the quality standard that we want, or take too long to get here. Because, for example, plastics, because we were very concerned about plastic. We were looking at maybe sourcing from the United States. But ironically, because that's the complete irony of this particular crisis. The people who instigated it are the ones who are coming off the best, because their supply is untouched, right? And I hear that their export terminals are completely full. I think in terms of capacity, they can't even export more than they want, even if they wanted to. Plastic from the US is made from ethylene, whereas ours is typically naphtha derived. So there's a specification mismatch. And it'll take, I was told, 45 days to get here, compared to, say, about 20 days or so from the Gulf, right? So we have this very uncomfortable situation where we can get supply from alternative sources, but it might not get here in time, which is why I'm thinking June, July is going to be the real point where we can see this crisis being very evident, because that's at the point where a lot of businesses run out of their old stock, I think, in terms of raw materials, and they're still waiting for the new one to come in.
Right. Okay. And this brings us to the point I think you were making at the start about, at least in terms of perception, this was the moment, now is the moment just as COVID is announced. And
yes.
The world is saying, oh, how is it going to impact us?
Yes.
Let's talk about the mindset, both for businesses and for the general public going into this crisis, come the second wave, come the real shortages, come the austerity that the government is going to have to impose on itself. What is it that you think Malaysians need to understand, whether they're business owners or in manufacturing, or they're just ordinary households?
Yeah, this is a supply crisis, and it's very different from the crises that we've gone through before, which are always about demand, right? And in a supply side crisis, you can't spend your way out of it because you cannot buy something that's not there, right? Our strategy, I think, as far as the government is concerned, the first part is actually securing basic supplies. I mean, that's mostly done. The second one is stretching the supplies that we already have. And that means it's not so much austerity. I think it's more about consciously, I think the consumption side has to be moderated, right? Because it's a supply side crisis. Like I said, you can't spend your way out of it, because having more money doesn't matter if you can't get whatever supply. So the government can do only so much, but I think it falls to the rakyat and businesses as a whole to be mindful about consumption, because the more you consume, the less is available for your neighbor or for your business partner or for your friends or your family, right? So we don't want to see panic buying. We don't want to say that.
Are we seeing any hoarding and stuff? Is that starting to emerge?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. We're starting to see some hoarding, especially at industrial level. Because obviously they were impacted first, right? They're the ones who are facing the shortages first, and we are seeing hoarding of that. Unfortunately, there's no legal framework for the government to prevent that, except unless it's a controlled item, right? And we would, the danger point would be if the general public starts doing that as well, right? So I think the message here is that we have to be mindful about consumption, because it's not just about yourself, it's also about your neighbor, your family, your friends. And it's not just about the government either. The government can only do so much in those areas because the government doesn't consume consumer goods, right? But the public does. So I think in that sense, I think understanding the nature of this crisis, understanding we need to go back to that spirit of COVID, kita jaga kita. I'm being very mindful about saying that because it's, coming from the government, right? But really, this is about us taking care of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Hisham, for being with us today.
Welcome. Always a pleasure.